This is the Iron Sharpens Iron movement, sharing insights into the power of people-centric leading.
Hi, this is Jim, and today we welcome to our tribe a retired U.S. Navy officer who now serves as the Director of Learning and Development for a major consulting firm where he has designed leader development programs for Fortune 500 corporations and consulted with teams across the full spectrum of industries. He's a three-time book author and has recently released a new book entitled Locked On Leadership, a leader's guide to high-performing team behaviors. The Iron Sharpens Iron movement is brought to you by N2 Growth, a leader in executive search, leadership development, and talent management. We find and develop the world's best leaders. Learn more about our practice by visiting us at n2growth.com or click on the link in the show notes of this podcast. Hi, Will. Welcome to the Iron Sharpens Iron Leadership Podcast. We're really happy to have you here today.
Oh, thank you, Jim, for having me on. I'm very excited to be here.
Well, with our intro to you, everybody has heard your bio and not only your journey in the world of leadership, but you practice this every single day. You're out there on the front lines, at the Fortune 500 level, dealing with executives and, what does leadership look like in the 21st century? And believe it or not, that's what this audience is really seeking. We are empowered as a tribe to talk about leadership and mentorship, followership, coaching, all of those kind of things. We know that you're the guy to talk with. And so I'm super excited to have you and to kind of go through a small journey with you. I use that word a lot on just learning some of the things, tips and tricks, and having a great talk with you. And with that, I know that the timing's good on this podcast because you have just recently launched a brand new book, and it's entitled Locked On Leadership, a leader's guide to high performing team behavior. That's a pretty cool name. And I'd love to know what motivated you to even want to write a book.
Well, that's been this one's particularly been a kind of a lifelong journey, to use your word. I kind of started not intentionally. I tell people that I wanted to be Captain Kirk when I grew up, when I was a kid, because, used to watch Star Trek, holding the rabbit ears of a television on a UHF channel way back in the 70s. You know how that was.
I
And
do. I do.
I thought Captain Kirk was who I wanted to grow up to be, but I've learned a lot over the few decades since that maybe that's not the best model of leadership or a realistic model of leadership. So I got into Navy ROTC because I thought I wanted to be a ship captain someday, and the kind of the genesis of the idea of this book and its structure was that a Marine captain, when we became midshipmen, handed me a trifold wallet-sized card with the Marine Corps' leadership principles on them. Great advice. Still in use in the Marine Corps today. Great list. You can easily Google it if anyone is interested in it. And although the advice is great, it was very high level.
Right.
And so I struggled day in and day out. How do I operationalize these principles? What can I do today, right now, to emulate the principles that are on this list? So I carried that around for years.
Can I ask you a question? Let
Sure.
me ask you a question. What year was that you got that?
Well, that would have been about 1986.
So do you feel when you were like, how can I operationalize things from this wallet size, high level trifold? Do you think the world has changed from 86, 87 to 2020?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's when you were doing the intro, talking about does leadership change from the 20th to the 21st century? And I think absolutely it is a different context. People don't change, but the context changes. So, as leaders, we have to understand what those changes are. I mean, there's been tremendous change in a general way from kind of a industrial economy to a post-industrial knowledge economy where we are
Right.
now. And right now, so many people are working from home, we are truly knowledge workers. Even technicians and technical support people are truly knowledge workers. And you have to lead that a little bit differently than we might have led in the mid to late 20th century on a factory floor or some other very quantitative production kind of operation. So that
Interesting.
was one of the impetus behind the book as well, is how do you apply fundamentals that were true in the 20th century to new fundamentals or context in the 21st.
And reading your book, one of the things that I read that you put right in the forward, basically, that you were like, I'm not going to try to recreate the definition of leadership or have you
Mm.
kind of, say, oh, there's a new art and science to it. You're just going to define it a little bit. And if I'm hearing you right, it's really based off of the context of today.
Right, right. Is what are you trying to do? And understanding that fundamentally leadership is the way I like to think of it is leadership and management are different things, but they're two sides of the same coin. And leadership requires you to really understand human behavior. And in my
Yeah.
experience, um, both in the military, though I think military leadership on the whole is superior to that which you find typically in the civilian world. I have encountered poor leaders in the military and I've encountered excellent leadership in the civilian world. It's understanding what the fundamentals of leading and understanding human behavior are. But there's a lot of
Yes.
ignorance out there. And when I've been working on this book for 10 years, there were some things as I did my research that I fundamentally did not understand. And I thought I had strong experience in leadership over a few decades. And there were some counterintuitive things, especially around motivation.
Around motivation. Can you give me an example? Is that based off of generational or is that just off of new research because of how we're able to understand the human a
Right.
little bit more, in particular how the brain works and things like that?
We do know a lot more because there's been a lot more research. We're kind of in a renaissance, so to
Yeah.
speak, of human cognition and understanding human psychology now that we didn't really understand. We were kind of going on, just fundamental wisdom.
Instinct,
It wasn't
hunches. Yeah.
all right, and instinct as well. And a lot of the maxims that we adhered to way back when may not have been fundamentally correct. And one of the things that in Locked On Teams, what I do is I identify 28 fundamental guidelines. And one of those guidelines is thank and reward. And so, a little chapter about thanking and rewarding it properly. For instance, one of the things that has really come to light recently, and if a great book I can recommend is Daniel Pink's Drive, which explores how money motivates people and fundamentally that it doesn't. And I think in the 20th century, we're finally kind of getting away from this, but the fundamental assumption was you motivate people with money, and that's just simply not true. You'd think it would make sense that if you want to get more out of someone, you pay them more, but it actually works at cross purposes. And what you really have to do is engage people at a fundamental level in work that they believe in and enjoy doing first and foremost, and be thankful for what they do and be thankful of their efforts. And so those are some of the things that I think were not entirely surprising to me as I was doing the research, but how much more we really do know now about human motivation than we did in the past.
Would you say that crosses generations though? Would you say like when in particular I'm a huge recognize and reward kind of person myself too because
Mhm.
again I think we're both the type of leadership uh scenario folks that believe in human centric leading. But a lot of times when you talk about rewarding individuals, people go down the trail of saying, "Oh, that's a millennial thing.
Mhm.
That's a Gen Y thing." Do you believe it is truly generational on people seeking, the trophy, or is it human nature to want to be recognized,
It's human
no matter
nature.
what the generation?
Yeah, I no matter what the generation, it is human nature to feel like your work matters. that what you're doing every day has some point and purpose. And
Yeah.
I think you'll agree with me. In the military, that's a little easier for us to make that connection for people. It's still a challenge, but it's a little bit easier than many of the companies out there that are producing widgets. You gotta help people understand how whatever it is they're doing matters, not just to themselves and their team and their company, but the society as a whole. And that's kind of the millennial challenge. It's not that it's something unique to millennials, that they kind of have this expectation. This is this is, I think, fundamental to um, the new economy, the new knowledge economy. And conscious capitalism is kind of the phrase that you hear a lot nowadays. Is, uh, we've kind of surpassed the age of just producing widgets for the sake of selling widgets, and we're more conscious about our effect on our own
You bet.
society and our own economy and our own environment and all those things. And millennials are very attached to that. So the challenge for leaders is to make that connection very clearly and very strongly for them, pretty much on a daily basis, to keep them engaged.
Do you have examples of what is a true reward to someone? If you said, we kind of started out talking about the recognition and reward as it's not monetarily. At a certain point, it peaks monetarily. So, what would be a good example then of what a leader could do to truly reward somebody or to recognize someone to where it matters?
Well, first off, thank yous go a long way. So
Ha.
always thank people for what they're doing. But I'll tell you an example of a truly high performing team. And this is something that I witnessed because at the company I work for at Afterburner, peer recognition is a very strong uh, part of our culture. It,
Mm,
it in truly high performing teams, you'll know you are encountering and working with or observing a high performing team when you see the various members of the team thanking each other, thanks for doing that, and calling out group accomplishments for the work that someone else has contributed, and it's not just their own work. That and that's something really curious I discovered, and there's now research to show this, is that thanks and rewards coming from the leader is one thing, but the real
hmm
challenge, the most powerful thanks and rewards, are thanks and rewards coming from peers. But the leader's the one that has to cultivate and orchestrate that environment, and they have
Right.
to show the value of that and demonstrate it and model it themselves, because that's just not going to happen by magic. That is a real competency of a great leader, is to be able to develop a culture like that.
So, Will, you just took the words out of my mouth on the end about with culture. You think it's a bit of a learned behavior? Do you believe it's a leader's responsibility? Kind of no matter where they are in the leadership pyramid, whether they're at the very top executive level or if they're a first line, supervisor that's a leader. Is it is it their responsibility to show what right looks like? Should that be a part of a leadership task when you are simply thanking someone? Because a lot of these peers will potentially grow up in organizations that have never seen this as a part of their culture.
Right, right. I, Jim, I don't think it's going to come as any surprise to you when I say that modeling the appropriate behaviors is one of the core attributes of a great leader. And that, in fact, that's number three on the list of 28. And I phrase it as model appropriate behaviors, because behaviors are going to be appropriate to context, and what's appropriate in one company or organization may not be appropriate in another. So the leader has to
Sure.
really understand, what is it that we're trying to do, what is it we're all about, what's our purpose, our point, and then emulate the culture. I was just working with a firm fairly recently, of just a few weeks ago, where the leadership really understood how important modeling the appropriate behaviors is for them, fundamentally for their culture, but they had not articulated them. So that's sort of another part
Ah,
of that, is
yeah.
you have to know as a leader what those behaviors should be. Probably should write them down, So articulation of behavior is an important step in that. You can think you're modeling the right things, but are other leaders in the team or members of the team, do they know what the right behaviors are? So that's another challenge for leadership.
The army has a very simple phrase when they talk in leadership terms and in educational terms of be, know, and do.
Yes.
And when we talk about it in these terms, when you're saying, you know, the leadership team knew what the right things were, but they didn't necessarily articulate it, that's the do portion.
Right.
A lot of leaders walk around and read tons of books or go to seminars, but do they do? Do they have the action? Is it an actionable trait? Because only at that point, when a leader is actually in action and a leader is using it as, a verb, leading, that's when the payoff really comes, in my opinion.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Um, I, that's an important part and one of the fundamental themes of this book. Yeah, and that was my first. Remember with the trifold card I was telling you about,
Hmm.
that for the Marine. How do you action those on a daily basis? And that was part of the point. So, for example, one of my top guidelines is model appropriate behavior. So, how do you do that on a daily basis? I have one action that I call put on your uniform. And now, for those of us in that have a military background or in the military, that's an easy piece. When we put on our uniform, it's like wearing the flag. You walk a little taller, you act with greater deference to everyone, you show people greater respect because you know, right, that you physically feel the burden of modeling the appropriate behaviors that everyone expects.
Absolutely.
Well, how do you do that in if you're working for a company that you don't have a uniform, you just put on your polo or your dress suit, whatever it is, on a daily basis, maybe jeans and a t-shirt in many IT organizations today. So if you're a new manager, a new leader, how are you going to model the right behaviors? How are you going to put that that metaphorical uniform on? When you think about it, here's a simple example. Many organizations, you have to put a name badge on. It might have your credentials or your scan code or a chip that gives you access to the doors. That's mentally when you put that on in the morning. You say, okay, as I put this on, part of the ritual is that I'm taking on the mantle of leadership and I'm going to model I'm going to model the right kind of leadership while I'm wearing this for sure. Maybe it's carrying some object or a coin. We have a culture of challenge coins in the military now, or some other object that you can touch throughout the day. Maybe it's actually a uniform in terms of a lot of companies. You put on your company logoed polo and go off.
Right.
Ritualize those kinds of things in your daily behavior to remind yourself that I'm behaving like a leader right now.
I love that. I love that. And so, what's the kind of the theory behind how you titled the book? So, we'll get into locked as an acronym, but doing research on you, it seemed like you were, kind of going back and forth on after locked on leadership. What's the subtitle? And can you kind of get into what was your thinking about how you ended up saying that it's a leader's guide to high performing team behaviors? And even though we've talked so far in the first 15 minutes or so, really about leaders' behaviors, how does that really transfer into a team's behavior?
Great question. Long answer. I'll try to keep.
That's why we're listening on podcasts. These are all great.
This is the other part of the origin story. Is I came to Afterburner, which is a consulting firm, training firm. Now I'm in year 13, and one of the things that we do is we work with often leadership teams in a variety of industries, but we at the time taught and we still teach a very process oriented way of planning, briefing, executing, and debriefing in an iterative cycle. So that was one of the things that we've done extremely well over the 23, 24 years of the company's existence. Well, when you debrief, and in the Army, they call it an after action review. In the civilian world, they often call it like a post-mortem, things like that. It's just taking a look at how well did you execute your plan, what went right, what went wrong. Well, you think about that, one of the core functions of debriefing is root cause analysis. Because if you just, one thing you can't do in debriefing or AARs or whatever name you want to give to it is blame people. You've got to blame the system. You got to find what went wrong in the system as a whole and address that, because people are only going to perform as well as the system is going to let them. So that's a long journey to
Hmm.
get to what we recognized that root cause analysis needed was a short list of root causes. And
Ha.
the acronym LOCKED was something we developed a long time ago to provide a simple structure for root cause analysis. So you're probably going to ask this question next, so I'll preempt it a little bit. But locked, LOCKEND,
Yep.
are the 6 fundamental traits of high performing teams. They're L, led well, leadership. They're organized, O. C, they communicate well. K and E, knowledge and experience. They use both of those, and those are very different things. They've used both of those to arrive at decisions and develop good plans that are executable. And D, they do all of that with discipline. And by discipline, we mean focus and prioritization. So that, and we hadn't, in the early years of developing that short little acronym, we hadn't gotten to the really granular level of saying, okay, what are the activities under the L? What are the activities under the O? So that's what this book does, is it granularizes and gives a rational structure to what high performing teams actually do. And it's not just the leader, it's the whole team behavior. So that's the long answer.
Well, I'm gonna make it even longer on you.
Uh-oh.
So I need your help in breaking this down a little bit more, because one of the things that your comments intrigued me about was you were like, don't blame the human, blame the process
Right,
or the systems.
right.
So what really makes you say that? Because I know you've seen this, and almost all of us have seen this. Like, it's very easy, especially when there's not a large crowd around and you close the door and it's just the leadership team. Boy, those fingers come out and they
You're
are
right.
blaming Johnny or Sally or Tommy or Sue. That's usually one of the first instincts people go to do. They don't blame the system because they'll defend their system and they'll say it was the human that broke that down. So I'm really intrigued to know what makes you so bold to say don't blame that human. It is your system.
Right, right. Um, Great question. So, in the time that it took you to get that question out, I actually had to open the book up, right? Because there's a great quote in
All
here.
right.
I had to flip to it real quickly. It's on page 71. It's an introduction by author James Clear. I'm trying to remember the name of his book off the top of my head. It's a wonderful book. I highly recommend James Clear. But he says in his book, you do not rise to the level of your goals. You fall to the level of your systems. And
Huh.
here's why I say that's so important. Going back to debriefing and understanding just exactly what it is that goes wrong or goes right in a mission, a plan, whatever it is you're trying to do,
Mm-hmm.
is that at the end, if you start blaming, you never fix anything. You just ultimately crush people and get rid of them. You build a case against the person and provide all the attribution necessary to get them off your team. That's the bureaucratic answer. The
Right.
the the good leader's answer is to say, look, that person may not have done they may have made a mistake. They could have created a failure, but they created it for a reason and they didn't mean to. The first the first response of a leader is to assume best intentions. and then go beyond that and say, okay, what did we not do? What did the system we created not provide for that we can change, adapt, adjust, improve in some way so that the person won't fail again in the future? And it's probably a great point to bring up that story. I don't know if I told you this story, but it's a self admission about the book itself. So
Okay.
you're going to laugh. Everyone will laugh about this. So this book, I don't know, I took a year to write it. And for anyone that's written a book, the basic process is you write a manuscript and you send it off to a publisher. They do all of the editing, they do the design work, and as an author, you get it all back in the end, and you approve or disapprove and say you need to fix this, change that. Okay. Well,
Right.
I've been through this a few times. This is the fourth book or third book or the fourth, depending on how you look at it, that I've written. So I know I've been through this process before. And we got the author's first bound editions back in the office, and I got my copy. I picked it up. Yep, looks great, and handed it out in the office. It took weeks before everyone or anyone at all noticed there was a misspelling on the cover.
On the cover.
On the cover. I'm keeping these as nostalgic
Sure.
reminders. Now, what did ultimately? This is principle number one of leadership. You got to take responsibility.
Yep.
Ultimately, that's my responsibility. It's my failure. That book got printed with a misspelling on the cover because I didn't see it. The editors didn't see it. And it's just because it's something you don't look at. That's what we mean by systems. Now, how do you fix that in the future? Well,
Right.
that's how do you build a system that prevents that? Because human beings, we're not cognitively perfect. We're not computers. I looked at everything on every word on the back cover I'd been through 3 times. I was sure it was okay. I just didn't even look at the front cover because why would I even think to look at something so obvious that plenty of other eyes have looked at? That's my fail. It's also the editor's fail of the book and the fail of
Right.
everyone that touched it.
Right.
So you don't blame leaders, you take responsibility and you fix it. And to the credit of the publisher, they owned it. They said they were the ones that introduced the error in the first place. It wasn't me, right? But it's still my responsibility. It's my book. I owned it. So
So
the system, you've got to look at the system because humans are going to make those kinds of errors. And if leaders can kind of step out and look at it from the big picture of process, how do you get from point A to point B? And how do you make
right.
that path more uh, how do you create a path that supports accurate outcomes? That's what you really have to think about and do.
So you said thank you for sharing that story to begin with. That shows your vulnerability a little bit because we'd be all none the wiser because we're seeing the perfect copies. But what a great lesson for sure. And you mentioned some things in there that you were like, "Hey, we're humans. We make mistakes. We're not computers. We're not robots." And I think that's another important comment that you make because we all need to be reminded that we are human, and therefore, from a leadership perspective, we have to learn to understand human-centric leading, right? Because we
Right.
are not robots. We don't just make kind of checklist, driven decisions. There's variables in there, and you make a little bit of a nod to that in your book also when you talk about this really cool term that, quite frankly, I'm going to steal from you, Will, and it's called soft technology.
Oh, you like that, huh?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
love it. I love it. Can you tell us a little bit about what is that phrase? How does it weave in between everything that we've just been discussing?
Well, thanks for asking that question. Because we live in a time where technology is just so omnipresent. And we think it's going to solve all our problems. I like to look at it, leadership in terms of the fundamentals that I lay out in the book is a type of technology. And you think, well, what is technology? And I said, well, the first question you have to ask is what's science? Okay. Science just tells you what is. right? It's a
Right.
certain truth. Technology takes the truth and turns it into something usable, like a tool. So that's hard technology. Your smartphone is hard technology. Well, in the cognitive realm, in the human realm, if you take the science and the, like we were talking about earlier, all that we've learned in the cognitive sciences and the psychology about leadership and how people think and how they behave, if you take that and turn it into a technology, that's what the book is. It's meant to be read like any other book, but it's also intended to be a reference so that once you read it, you can, as you're reading, it's like, I can do better here. I really need to concentrate on this. Oh, and this thing down there. And then you can refer back to it and use the actions to incorporate into your daily leadership work. That's technology. So I've called it, instead of hard technology, a soft technology.
Oh, I love it. And you also refer, you say it a couple times in here, even though it's an acronym and that's very military heavy, of course, which we all embrace from a military community. But you say it's not a checklist. This is something that dives deeper into really reflecting on how to change your behaviors if you need to, or adjust, or reminders, or things like that. And I think that's a little bit of your secret sauce here, that it isn't intended. I believe, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but it's not intended just to flip to page 57 and execute on that particular thing.
That's absolutely a great point to talk about for a moment, because what is a checklist? Well, a checklist really, if let's say if you're a pilot and military aviation uses checklists very well. These are very succinct documents of what switch to flip, what lever to pull. Uh, as I was an engineer in the Navy, we had the same kinds of things, operating machinery and systems on board ship. Push this button, turn this switch. Okay.
Right.
Leadership is not a hard technology. We were just talking about that. It's a soft technology. So if you took my book and applied it across the board, all the advice in there, there's some point at which it would fail you. It would not generate the results you expected, because as human beings, and we've also talked about that, is context matters, and leadership is a tremendously complex endeavor. You can't say that A plus B yields C every single time. So instead of a checklist, I've used the word guidelines, but probably the best term, most people have never heard this word before, is heuristic. It's HEURISTIC, heuristic. And that's a fancy word for rule of thumb. A rule of thumb, if you think about it, it usually works. It works most of the time, but it's not guaranteed to work, right? And leadership, because you're dealing with human behavior, which can be very erratic and very different from one context to the next, you can't apply a checklist kind of approach to it. I so deeply wanted to do that. I thought, wow, I really would have been able to achieve something great if I could create a checklist for leadership. But you have to recognize that that's not possible. There's
That's right.
not an easy solution across the board.
That's right. That's why there's countless thousands of leadership books, because there is no golden answer.
Right, right,
It's just a little bit of breadcrumbs to lead you down your own personal leadership journey, to get you to hopefully become the best leader that you can become. But because at the end of the day, the greatest variable is the humans that you lead.
right.
There's no doubt about that.
The humans
That
are a
is
complex actor in a complex system. What you get is very near chaos. So you have to take that in mind.
absolutely. Absolutely. So, speaking of chaos, it's a very violent world. It's uncertain. It's chaotic. It's ambiguous. VOCA as a military term. But you look at today, even as we're doing this podcast recording, we're on the heels of the coronavirus outbreak in the global situation that's placing us all in. So, whether we're stepping outside of the book itself now, but just through the eyes of you as a a leader developer, you're in the consulting world of dealing with these very high level executives and leaders throughout the world. What are some of the things that you think are important from a leadership perspective, to handle something in a environment today?
Oh, great question. I had to think about that a little bit. I always go back to fundamentals. Like a book is about fundamentals, but every organization has a fundamental purpose. And I'm thinking about, if you remember the Tylenol scare from, what was it, the 1980s, and Johnson and Johnson's response to that crisis was to look at their fundamental principles. We're here to, I can't remember off the top of my head how they articulated it. Was to help people, and to do anything less than pull all of their Tylenol off the shelves was not an acceptable. They knew what they had to do because they knew what they existed to do and what to be. And I think leaders have to fundamentally understand that. That's one of the most exciting things I get to do, is work with
Hmm.
at the top of organizations with CEOs, C-suite, top executives, because a lot of companies, they kind of know what those things are, but they don't articulate them well, and therefore they can't write it on the wall and say, "This is what we're here to do. Let this guide your actions."
Hmm.
So that's
Is that
that's
out of fear? Is it out
no,
of
I
fear? Is it?
think they just don't take the time. There, and I that's why I say it's so rewarding to work with. I just finished working with a few weeks ago. I was mentioning this earlier, with an outstanding company, extraordinarily well led, great people, good leaders that recognized they needed just that, but they didn't know how to go about it. So we came in to help them articulate what we call their purpose and their principles.
Hmm.
What are the behavioral rules for being in our organization? And this is a financial organization that does investments. I guarantee you that not everyone in finance and banking, and there's a great deal of genuine understanding of the value they provide to society and want to do the best job they can for everyone. So that's why I enjoy doing what I do, is helping those people articulate that, because once they do, then they're able to model those behaviors like we were talking about earlier, and spread it throughout the organization. And when bad things happen, they know what to lean on. They know what those fundamental principles are to guide their action. Therefore, so I think that's where it all begins. Know why you're there. Why are you in the fight in the first place?
Yeah, what a great point. And again, this goes back to our thing that in some senses you say, it is literally the most complicated thing that you can do is be a leader, but yet it's kind of simple too, isn't it? There's a little bit of a simplicity to leadership. The problem is 99% of leaders just fail to execute on their abilities to lead
Yeah, yeah.
in those
That's an
situations.
interesting
Yeah.
point. They That's the D in locked,
Ah,
is having
yeah.
the discipline to do what you say you're going to do and know where your
Nice.
priorities
Yeah.
are, and then to focus and get it done.
Yep. So important. So important. And again, you see it in a failure level much higher than an actual approval level because just people are afraid to take that step.
Yeah,
So,
and just
um,
as another note on that subject, is one of the problems that I see in organizations today is they're trying to do too much. And we have a term for
in
that, task
terms of what?
saturation. Strategically, project wise, big picture, is one
Hmm.
thing that I can tell you is so critical, especially for senior leaders at the top of the organization, is determining the few things that are really important and
Hmm.
getting the rest of the stuff out of the way so people can march forward and execute on those few things. One of the
Yeah.
matrixed organizations, if you know what I'm talking about, is kind of the bane of modern existence, where you might be a team member in an organization and so many of them will assign you to 6 or 8 or 10 different projects. Well, which one's most important? You can't do it all. You know, that's kind of the fundamental problem in organizations. Everything's important. If everything's important, nothing's important. So leaders
That's exactly
have
correct.
got to figure out what are the real priorities. And some people will argue that there's only one priority. It's a singular word. And I disagree with that. But there aren't 10 of them.
Right.
There's usually about 3. That's what my experience tells me.
Absolutely correct. I think we've talked once before on this, just in our conversations in our past. Is I'm a huge believer in the power of threes, and I know like one of your locked acronyms is communications,
Mhm.
and I think it's important for leaders if they can communicate 3 of those priorities,
Right.
or 3 of their main priorities, or 3 key points to the priority. The human has the ability to absorb 3 main factors, symbols, any of those kind of things, and be able to operate off of that. When it starts to get into the fourth and the fifth items and on, it becomes fuzzy and they literally can't prioritize it themselves or remember it quickly. But if you get into a very simple 3, it is something along those lines of communications that everybody can kind of get behind. And it's, again, simple to communicate, to your point in your locked acronym.
Absolutely. I'm glad you brought that up. I wish I'd quoted you for that in the book. That's one thing I've left out. But in that communication of ideas, absolutely critical. And another thing that in that rule of 3 is for leaders to understand that there's basically 3 points of alignment. And that's
Mm,
another important part of leaders is helping people in the organization align to in 3 steps. And so you think about 3 things. One is what's the vision? Where are you going long term? What's the strategy? What are you doing right now? Those big picture priorities to get you to that vision. And then what are you doing today and tomorrow and this week to support that strategy? Those are the kind of the 3 important waypoints along the journey of alignment, so to speak.
yeah, absolutely. Again, something that's fairly simple, but needs the act of execution, the act of action to actually move forward and to make it important for the team.
Yep.
Well, Will, I'll tell you, I think I could speak to you for hours on this. And I hope at some point what we could do is even have another podcast, because I'm not even done asking you 1,000 questions and getting inside your head, because you certainly know the arts and science of leadership. And it's just been amazing to spend some moments with you kind of talking about this. And most importantly, talking about the goodness of your book, for sure, because I think everybody would get something out of it. I love the fact that you're not telling people what to do, but you're just teeing up a whole bunch of ideas that people should wrap their brains around. And all good leaders and followers should take a real good look at this and check their own behaviors and seeing if they're more aligned towards that. So I
Absolutely.
thank you for joining the tribe today and giving us some insights into, your Locked On Leadership book. It truly was a guide to high performance, not only in the team but in the personal levels too. So we really do appreciate your time.
I really appreciate the opportunity, Jim. You might have to twist my arm a little bit harder to appear on one of your future podcasts, but not too much harder.
Well, we'll definitely get into more of human centric leadership. And I think this audience will certainly eat it up for sure. So, again, Will, thanks for joining the Iron Sharpens Iron Leadership podcast. It's been an honor and a privilege to talk to you. And we will hear another podcast soon enough. And for our audience, we hope that you join us again on the next podcast.
Thank you, Jim.
Thanks for joining our leadership movement this week. We really enjoyed talking with Will about his new book and the lessons learned about human-centric leading. Don't forget, our show notes are posted on the website with key leader takeaways and suggested action plans. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast and tell a friend so we can continue to build our tribe. Join our Facebook group to get even more behind-the-scenes action and exclusive content for leaders. Until next time, remember that iron sharpens iron. Make yourself and others around you better every single day.